give up. One, two, one, two, 3, 4. Hold it. Now.
man with 25 Grammy Awards, 5 Oscars, 4 Golden Globes, and a record-breaking 54 Oscar nominations, musical scores for over 100 films, plus orchestral works for concertos, Olympic marches, and everything else that you could possibly name. Tonight is all about the fantastic composer and classical genius of John Williams, because that's what he is. When you regard him in the same light as the likes of Mozart and Beethoven and Tchaikovsky and Chopin and Rachmaninoff and Liszt, John Williams is in the same regard. I was just chatting to somebody and sort of saying, in today's age, people go to the movie theatres, people play games, and they listen to the music compositions that are released out into the world. And the only difference is they are going to the theatre, they are playing the game. They are no longer going to listen to the classical music of the old age. It is a completely different world, but it has the same values and the same structure as those old composers. So tonight is all about John Williams, other than our 3 pieces at 11:30. So the 3 pieces, as per normal, is those 3 pieces for you guys to try and guess what the connection is. But first, we're going to dive into and we are going to enjoy some of John Williams' greatest and most beautiful hits, starting off with something from the Harry Potter franchise. And the fantastic main theme from E.T., the extraterrestrial. Now, what I have tonight, obviously being Wednesday, and we go through some form of story or some form of reading and anecdotes from various different places, from movies to books to TV shows. Tonight, I found something absolutely fantastic, which is from symphony.org, which is an hour-long interview with John Williams himself, and is all conducted by Woods, who asks the questions and leads on the conversation. Now, we're going to start off just after the start of this interview with Woods's first question, which goes like this. What was the first time you heard something that you had written played by an orchestra? Williams then repeats, I had a neighbour in New York when I was maybe about 10 or 12, and I played the trumpet. My father explained to me that I had to write the trumpet part a tone higher because of the key the instrument was in. That was a eureka moment for me, that you had to write for each instrument in its own respective clef or key. In high school, I remember orchestrating and conducting a little show for a group of student performers, including my late wife. This was in the late 40s in North Hollywood, California. So, as a youngster, I had occasion to write things and have them played back to me. It was always a learning process. The first time I remember writing for a larger ensemble was during my service in the Air Force when I was 19 or 20 years old. I would do arrangements for concert band, and we had a 50-piece band. And I wrote arrangements and adaptations and conducted them. It was thrilling for me. And we had very good players in the band, and again, lots of brass. So those were the first significant sounds that I put together. Learning conducting for me was purely an act of self-defense. When I began to write music for films, there were music directors at each studio. They had the authority and responsibility to conduct the words of their composers. I used to sit there for my early television programs and films, watching and listening to these music directors who I could tell had never seen the score before. I squirmed in, with my score on my lap, thinking if I could get onto the podium, I could better explain to the orchestra what my intentions were. These notes should be shorter, those longer, those too short. We have to better tune the winds, etc. Though, as a happening, one of the music directors, actually a very good conductor and violinist, couldn't conduct my score one day. His office called and asked if I can conduct the session. No one asked me if I knew how to conduct or if I'd ever studied it, but I did know the score very well, and I had been a pianist in the orchestra for a few years by then, so I also knew the players very well, and it went very nicely. It went on that way until I worked in television, where I was composing and conducting scores for long-hour shows, sometimes as much as 20 to 25 minutes a week, which, in those days, was a lot. Remembering Emily, and finale from Warhorse, conducted and composed by John Williams. Welcome to Dreamcatcher Radio with our late night lullabies here on this fantastic Wednesday. Now I already know because I received the message. This is the moment. Well, at least for John, this is your moment. This is your moment that you've been waiting for, because John, for at least the last week, has been on point with his guesses. So tonight's free piece connection is next, and I'm not going to ruin it for you, but I am going to give you a little bit of a hint. Tonight's free piece connection is nothing to do with John Williams. But they are all connected. They are all connected in some way. So the rules are, they could be something to do with a composer, something to do with a person, something to do with an individual word. But all three pieces are connected in one way. So whether you're on your own, whether you are with friends or family, this is the game. The first person to guess what the connection is gets the bonus points for tonight. So we wish you all the best. Here are your three pieces. finishing on with Ryanda Suma with When She Loved Me from Toy Story. Now, who got the connection? Who got the connection? I got the first email within about 2 minutes of the second song. So, John, yes, you were on point, and I'm going to have to make these so much more difficult and so much more harder because John is on point and John is going on a streak at this moment in time. So we had When She Loved Me from Toy Story. Before that, we had the theme from Forrest Gump. And then the first one was from the Da Vinci Code. So obviously, the connection was Tom Hanks, who got the points within their circles, within their groups. I know, there's probably a good few of you in which got those special points this evening. Anyway, we will go back to our interview with John William. And Woods starts off the question with coming back to this side of the Atlantic. I want to talk about the concerts that you've done with American orchestras, conducting special evenings of your own music. Sometimes you've brought Steven Spielberg with you, to the great joy of audiences. When you both came to the Seattle Symphony in 2017, we had decided, as the concert was already sold out, we wouldn't tell the audience that Steven would appear. I remember when you turned to the audience and said, "Please welcome my friend, Steven Spielberg." And then Steven walked out on stage. That was one of those moments you live for as an orchestra manager. Seeing the audience electrified with that once-in-a-lifetime moment. I know that it's been very personal for you, going to those orchestras and giving back to them. William then replies, "I've loved those concerts. They've allowed me to work with so many great orchestras, meeting them, getting to know them, and so on. Some years before I was conducting the Boston Pops, I did a few of these concerts and enjoyed them very much. My feeling is that I can only put dots on paper. It doesn't become music until it's interpreted by a great orchestra and has become an audience who are able to hear it. Then what's written on the paper becomes music, becomes a communal act. The orchestra is part of the audience, and the audience surrenders itself to the orchestra for an hour or 2 or 3. As a composer, I feel a great debt to interpreters and performers of my own music. They're partners in the creative process. In terms of history, as you know, my father was an orchestral musician, and I don't believe that when he was working in the 1930s and 40s, orchestral musicians had a pension or retirement funds or health plans. So I've had a great pleasure in being able to do a number of pension fund benefit concerts for orchestras. Not asking for a fee, but simply being able to support something for today's musicians that my father didn't have. We've made great progress, and there's more still to be done. I feel as a composer and as a musician that I owe this to my orchestral music colleagues. And it's so wonderful that Steven has joined me on any number of occasions. It's been great fundraising success whenever we've done it. He loves music, and he drives music. Woods then continues, Steven's father was a prescriber for the LA Phil for years, wasn't he? Williams then replies, I think he must have been. Earlier in his life, when they were living in Philadelphia, they were subscribers, I believe, to the Philadelphia Orchestra. Steven was taken there as a child and frequently by his parents. His mother was a very good amateur classical pianist, and he can't get enough of the orchestra. Whenever we go out and do these concerts, he gets a childlike thrill from meeting the orchestra and accepting the audience applause from when he arrives. It's something we've done for a number of years, and I hope we can continue. So, let's listen to something from John Williams' own personal journey with the Boston Pops Orchestra and this absolutely amazing score from the film Hook, which features another absolutely iconic actor in John Williams. And what a better way than to take us in to the 12th of June with Across the Stars, the love theme from Star Wars, Attack of the Clones. And just coincidentally, today, obviously following our National Day calendar, is also National Loving Day, which is all about offering the complete freedom to be able to love somebody. And I think this is absolutely beautiful because on the 12th of June in 1967, the US Supreme Court decided that there can be no doubt that restricting the freedom to marry solely because of loving clarifications violates the central meaning of the Equal Protection Clause. So, in a nutshell, you are allowed to love somebody, and nothing can come of it. It is also National Rose Day as well. So I think that is absolutely beautiful. And let's go in to the start of this day with not one or two, but three phenomenal pieces with an iconic movie set and an iconic soundtrack from the Harry Potter franchise. and the finale from Harry Potter and The Prisoner of Azkaban. And I almost forgot. Well, I did forget. Let's not lie. Well, I did forget. We are meant to do the clock in and check in from midnight until past. So your next 13 minutes is your opportunity to clock in and check in with us at Dreamcatcher Radio. So if you're still with us, if you aren't quite asleep, just pop us a message. Send us an email at hello@dreamcatcherradio.com or pop us a message on any of the social medias. And if we remember, we'll give you a shout out. And if not, we'll just put it on the tally and then you can shout at us later. Anyway, let's go back to our interview with Woods and Williams. Now, this is on the latter part of the interview, and Wood starts off with the next following question and phrase. You've mentioned Bach and Mozart and Haydn, but I'm curious, what music from the past is most personal to you? The work that after a lifetime in music still resonates in a deep way. The music that you would take to a desert island. Williams replies, I have the experts and the expertise that so many musicians do. When I was a youngster, I loved jazz. I loved Stravinsky. I loved Prokofiev. And I still do. But now I read scores. Mostly Beethoven, some Haydn, some Mozart, and so on. And I think of the finale of the Jupiter Symphony and being such a glorious gem. I will use a word and probably regret it, but it's simply music. It's tonic dominant, dominant tonic. But it still seems to me that the greatest music we have, and my tastes have become quite simple. I'm writing every day, and when I'm not writing, I'm thinking about what the next passage is, or what it's going to be, or the next hurdle to overcome. I will listen to music and other music and often think, well, it's so much better than what I write. Why would I want to do that? What we already have is so miraculous. Harvey Sanch has written a new book about Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Schwarzenberg was talking about the process of composition. And as I recall, he basically says, I am paraphrasing, that you work as hard as you possibly can and put every bit of knowledge you have into your work. And when you've finished all that, some kind of profitable gift might emerge in the piece that is beyond anything that your meager talent would have anticipated. And that's the thing that lights the music. It's the spiritual element that most of us with our limited abilities can't put there. I also believe in that what he's saying is we can do our best work as hard as we can, do as much self-correcting and editing as possible to get things as beautifully made as they can be. And after the fact, you may be gifted by some aspect of spirituality in the music that you might not have anticipated. Woods then continues, John, the love that you have poured into your art and craft over so many decades is of a consistent source of joy to musicians and orchestras and audiences alike. On behalf of us all, and sincere thank you to you for everything that you have done for music. It is really a remarkable achievement, and it couldn't be a greater honour than to sit with you today and talk about it. And I think the next piece identifies the absolute beauty that John Williams can pour into a piece of music. And for him to sit there and say he doesn't think that his music is on the same level as some of the other composers of our generation is beyond me, because this is Schindler's List. and Anakin's theme from Star Wars and The Phantom Menace. Now we are just clicking on to 1/2 past the hour, which means we do the clocking and checking. So first and foremost, the moment that I asked about the clocking and checking, Mark and John pretty much sent the email across straight away and just said, I'm here, I'm awake. And Mia and Freya and Tiny are all still with us into the early hours of Thursday, the 12th of June. So if anybody else is still awake and still here, you've probably got about 15 minutes before we finally clock off for the evening. And we are going to finish off our magnificent interview with John Williams and Simon Woods with this final little extract, starting off with Simon Woods asking, tell me about the first time you heard an orchestra and what did it mean to you and how did it lead you onto this path? John Williams then replies, I remember very clearly going to my father's radio broadcast of Your Hit Parade. Every Sunday night, an orchestra directed by a man named Mark Warner did the American hit songs. My father was a member of CBS Radio Orchestra, and when I was 10 years old, in 1942, he took me to a rehearsal of Hammerstein's Theatre in New York. That was the first time, I think, that I heard anything resembling an orchestra. It was a large production for radio in those days, probably a 40 or 50-piece orchestra. In my early teen years, when I was taking music lessons every week in New York, I would go to his rehearsals. I'd sit behind him in the percussion section, in the back of the orchestra, and listen. I was fascinated watching the trombones and the trumpets, amazed that they would rest for a while, and then suddenly they would all come together for some magical reason. As time passed, I noticed the wind section and the string section, and then the harp and piano and so on, and it pinged my interest. As an early teen, I began examining some of my father's orchestral books, so that was how I became familiar with the sounds of an orchestra. Subsequently, I think the first orchestra I heard in a concert performance was the Los Angeles Philharmonic, after my family moved to Southern California. The conductor was Charles Munich. I think they played Frank D minor Symphony. Following that, I heard many orchestras at the Hollywood Bowl. I became, very early on, a lover, particularly, of brass music and brass playing, and later discovered the French horn, which was always one of my great loves. I was fascinated by the players, who I thought were wonderful, sitting as a child that close to the blast of the symphonica and hearing the way the brass all came together, whether indicated by the conductor or not. The players knew exactly where to play, and I was hooked. and a tree for my bed, and the absolute sublime London Philharmonic Orchestra. Now we have just over 20 minutes before we finish off our night of absolutely sublime John Williams hits. And what better way to finish off than something from Hook and then Fawkes, the Phoenix. I will see you in about 8 minutes' time before we end the whole of the radio show and go into our final huzzah of the evening. and the finale from Obi-Wan, also conducted and written by tonight's iconic composer of John Williams, which leads us on to our final 9 minutes of tonight's late night lullabies here on Dreamcatcher Radio. So we are going to finish off with probably one of John Williams' most iconic and memorable themes you can ever imagine. And then finally, with another brilliant theme of Leaving Hogwarts. But this is me, and this is the final moments of Late Night Lullabies. So, if you are awake, I will see you first thing tomorrow morning for morning motivation at 8 a.m. If not, I wish you all the most beautiful and sublime sleep tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure having you all and having you part of this journey and this exploration into John Williams. Anyway, I wish you all sweet dreams and sweet lullabies for the main theme from Jurassic Park. Good night, everybody.